It begins with a belief so widely accepted, it rarely feels like a belief at all, that more income will solve the problem, that the distance between where you are and where you want to be is simply a function of how much you earn. That once that number increases enough, the pressure will ease, the decisions will simplify, and the system will finally begin to work in your favour. This belief is not irrational on its surface. In many areas of life, more resources genuinely do produce better outcomes. More capital creates more options. More time creates more flexibility. More information produces better decisions in environments where information is actually the binding constraint. So the assumption that more income creates more financial freedom feels not only reasonable, but almost mathematically self-evident. But for many people, something quieter and more unsettling happens instead. The income rises, the pressure does not leave, it adjusts. It recalibrates to the new level and continues to occupy precisely the same psychological space it always occupied, now simply furnished with larger numbers and more sophisticated and expensive obligations. Because income, in isolation, does not change the structure of the system you are operating inside. It only increases the speed at which you move through it. And if the structure itself remains fundamentally unchanged, higher income does not produce freedom. It produces scale. More of the same dynamic, operating at a higher and considerably more expensive level than before. The mechanism behind this is subtle enough to avoid detection for years and sometimes for entire careers spent in the belief that the next increase will finally produce the margin the previous ones did not. As income increases, expectations follow closely and almost automatically behind. Not deliberately, not through any conscious decision to elevate the standard of living in proportion to earnings, but consistently and reliably, as though the increase in capacity creates a natural and corresponding increase in what that capacity is now supposed to provide and what the life around it is supposed to look like. Lifestyle expands to match what income now allows, rather than what genuine and unhurried reflection suggests is necessary or meaningful for the actual life being built. Obligations accumulate in proportion to earnings, each one individually reasonable and entirely justifiable given the current level of income and the expectations that level has quietly established. And the margin, the space between what arrives each month and what is structurally required to maintain the system that has grown up around it, remains narrow. Sometimes it becomes measurably narrower than it was at significantly lower income levels. Because the cost of entry into each successive lifestyle tier is not simply additive in any straightforward way. It arrives with fixed obligations, recurring expenses, social expectations, and a revised and elevated baseline of what normal now requires to sustain comfortably. The system rewards visible progress rather than structural change in the underlying financial position. A better apartment signals advancement to the people observing from the outside. A newer car reflects improvement in a language that the social environment readily recognizes, validates, and encourages further. A more expensive environment suggests upward movement in ways that feel like genuine confirmation that the effort and the sacrifice are producing the intended and expected result. But none of these alter the underlying equation in any way that matters across longer time horizons. They reinforce it. They increase the income required to sustain the system at its current level, while simultaneously producing the appearance of freedom and the consistent internal experience of constraint. At higher levels of income, the trap becomes considerably less visible from outside and significantly more comfortable to inhabit from the inside. Because externally, everything appears to be functioning precisely as intended, and as the cultural narrative around financial success suggests it should. There is evidence of success in every observable direction that the professional and social environment applies its attention to. There is proof of growth, of advancement, of a life that looks, from any reasonable external distance, like the product of sound decisions and disciplined financial management over time. But internally, the experience often feels largely and sometimes entirely unchanged from earlier and far less prosperous versions of the same fundamental situation. Decisions remain constrained by the income required to maintain the current structure and all the obligations that structure has accumulated around itself. Time remains fully and non-negotiably allocated to the activities that generate and protect the income the system now requires to function without visible distress. Risk remains genuinely and structurally difficult to take because the cost of the current system leaves limited and sometimes no real margin for outcomes that deviate meaningfully from the plan. And the dependence on continued income, rather than diminishing as the numbers increase and the career advances, becomes more critical and more deeply embedded in the structure of daily life than it was at any earlier and simpler stage, because the cost of maintaining the system has increased alongside every increase in the income required to support it, and the distance between the current income level and the minimum required to prevent the system from visibly and painfully contracting has in many cases grown significantly larger rather than smaller with each successive upgrade. This is where the misunderstanding at the center of most financial thinking becomes most consequential and most difficult to honestly examine. Wealth is assumed to be the natural extension and inevitable destination of income. The outcome that arrives when income rises far enough and remains elevated for a long enough period of sustained professional performance. But in practice, wealth is most often the result of something entirely and structurally different from income growth alone. Not how much flows in during the active and productive years of a career spent building and defending and maintaining the income, but how much is allowed to remain after the system's demands have been satisfied. And more critically, how much has been deliberately and consistently positioned to operate and compound independently of the continuous time and effort required to generate the income in the first place. Because income requires participation in ways that cannot be easily delegated or deferred indefinitely. It requires presence, performance, availability, and the ongoing and non-recoverable investment of time and cognitive capacity that represents the actual cost of every dollar earned in exchange for it. Wealth, at some threshold built through consistent and deliberate accumulation, does not require these things in the same way or to the same degree. It begins to generate outcomes that are no longer directly and entirely priced by the hours personally invested in producing them each month and each year. And the path to that threshold is not primarily or reliably through the continued growth of active income. It is through the deliberate and sustained interruption of the automatic expansion that income growth reliably and almost inevitably produces in the absence of conscious and consistent resistance to it. The trap persists across income levels and across entire decades of professional life because income feels unmistakably and satisfyingly like progress in the moment it arrives and increases. It is measurable in precise numbers that can be tracked and compared and improved upon with effort and performance. It is immediate in its arrival and visible in its effects on the life built around it. It is recognized and validated by every external measure that the professional and social environment applies to questions of financial advancement and personal success. But income also creates a specific and powerful form of psychological comfort that consistently and effectively delays the more difficult and more important questions that genuine and durable financial freedom ultimately requires someone to sit with honestly. Questions about whether the structure currently being optimized is actually capable of producing the outcome being expected from it over the time horizon that matters most. Questions about the nature and permanence of the dependency being quietly and incrementally built into the system with each lifestyle expansion that follows each income increase. Questions about whether the decisions being made reflexively and automatically with each new level of earnings are building something that eventually requires less of you, or simply something that requires more of you to maintain at the same level indefinitely. There is a quieter shift that changes the financial trajectory in ways that income growth alone cannot produce, regardless of how sustained or how impressive that growth becomes over time. It does not begin with earning more at the next level or the one after it. It begins with interrupting the automatic and largely unconscious expansion that follows every increase in income before that expansion has a chance to fully establish itself as the new and irreducible baseline. With creating deliberate and protected space between the increase and the upgrade that the increase makes financially possible and socially expected. With allowing income to accumulate long enough to be consciously and intentionally redirected before the system naturally and efficiently assigns every available dollar to obligations that will persist and compound long after the feelings that originally justified them have completely faded. And with gradually and consistently redirecting that accumulation into forms that do not require continuous active effort and personal presence to sustain, and that compound quietly in the background of a life being genuinely lived rather than a life being continuously managed and defended. Because the advantage that actually changes long-term outcomes is not in how quickly income grows across the productive years of a career. It is in how little of that income needs to remain continuously active and personally generated to sustain the life that income has made possible. Over time, this shift changes the fundamental nature of every financial decision in ways that no amount of income growth alone can replicate or substitute for. Risk becomes more tolerable when the cost of a poor outcome no longer threatens the structural integrity and stability of the entire system built around the income. Time becomes genuinely less constrained when the income required to maintain the current life is no longer entirely and non-negotiably dependent on the continuous personal investment of that time. Dependency on any single source of income begins to weaken as the accumulated capital operating independently of the active effort grows large enough to matter in ways that are felt rather than merely calculated. Not dramatically, and not in any single visible or celebrated moment of transformation, but in the quiet and gradual and compounding widening of the gap between what the life costs and what it now requires you to personally generate each month to sustain it without anxiety. The system does not break free all at once in any dramatic or visible way. It loosens slowly and almost imperceptibly across time. In the space deliberately maintained between income received and income immediately deployed into the next obligation, the system has identified as necessary and deserved, in the accumulation that is protected long enough to compound before the lifestyle has a chance to identify and absorb it into the baseline. In the obligations that are consciously and repeatedly not taken on, even when the income would comfortably and justifiably support them in the short term, and eventually across enough time and enough consistent decisions made deliberately in that direction, the question that governs the financial life changes in a way that cannot be reversed. It is no longer how much you earn in any given year or at any particular and temporary stage of a career that will eventually and inevitably end. It is how much of your life, your time, your available decisions, and your genuine sense of what remains possible is no longer priced by it. That is the shift, quiet, structural, and compounding across every year it is allowed to operate undisturbed. And it begins not with the next increase in income, but with what you choose, deliberately and repeatedly, not to do with the one you already have.